All right, maybe we should start right now. So welcome everyone to this webinar series, Research in Ancillary Ecosystem, which is hosted by the Tunisian Wildlife Association, TVS. We are very excited today to have Professor Jonathan Losos with us from Washington University in St. Louis. For those who don't know Professor Jonathan, he's a highly acclaimed evolutionary biologist. I don't really know where to begin to introduce him. His work is really outstanding. For those who want to know more in details about his research and career, there is this well-written article published by Science that I will share the link of here in case you need it. I don't want to go into the details of Professor Jonathan's research because I'm sure he will thoroughly explain it in his intervention, but to give just an overview, his work focuses on a wide range of topics, but he is best known for his studies of convergent evolution and adaptive radiation. Most of his empirical work has involved the evolutionary radiation of lizards in the genus Anolis, which can be found in the Caribbean and the Bahamas. I want also to mention his important role in mentoring many outstanding students and researchers. He is the author and editor of many books, including Lizard and Evolutionary Tree and Improbable Destinies. Professor Jonathan is surely a source of inspiration for many young scientists around the world, and I'm no exception. He has received a number of awards, including the Edward Osborne Wilson Naturalist Award. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Association of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Sciences. With us today as well, Professor Soufiane Kamoun, who will co-host with me this webinar and who will surely enrich the discussion later on. Professor Soufiane is a senior scientist at the Sunbury Laboratory. He's known for his contribution to our understanding of plant diseases and plant immunity. He received several awards and recognition, including the Noel Keane Award and Daiwara Adrian Prize. He was elected a fellow of the Royal Society, and he received the Linnean Medal for his outstanding contribution to plant science. I guess I'll give the word to Professor Soufiane, then we will listen to Professor Jonathan. So if you have any questions, do please write them in the chat box, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So Professor Soufiane, the word is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahir, and thank you so much, Professor Losos, to join us today and to have agreed to this seminar with this group. This is unusual. I don't think you've been to Tunisia before, and it's great that to some degree that this pandemic has enabled this type of interactions. I don't want to speak for too long, but I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, wildlife biology, natural history are not sciences that are very well developed and appreciated on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. So I'm someone who comes from Tunisia. I'm really pleased to see people like Zeher and the young people behind at TVS, the Tunisia Wildlife Association, and many other groups being so dynamic in being involved in not just studying biology in the broader sense, but also being interested in evolution, ecology, and also actually there's really some amazing work Zeher and his colleagues are doing in terms of conservation biology. They made me aware of regions of Tunisia that I actually did not appreciate, like for example the work they've been doing in the Nefza Reserve. They are trying to build up. So kudos to this guy, and thank you, Jonathan, for really agreeing to support this team. I'm sure they are very much inspired by your work and leadership. I know for a fact that you are Zeher's idol, so he's been very much inspired by your work, and I know he's very nervous today to host this event. So thank you so much. A second point I want to make is I'm gonna see if I can share my screen. Yeah, I can share my screen. So Zeher told me if I had a copy of your book, because he didn't believe me that I think that I read it. I did read it back in 2017. I don't have a copy because now I prefer to read books on Kindle. It's much easier for my eyesight. I think some of the other people in the audience can appreciate. But yes, I do have your book on my Kindle list. I share this with Saskia, my partner. It's right next to Sex in the Kitchen Table, which is also a very interesting book on plant biology. But there it is, and it was a very inspiring book for me actually, and my student, Ola, who just published a paper on convergent evolution. And although we work with plant immunity and plant pathology, your work and your ideas on evolution and that sort of deep philosophical question of how deterministic evolution is were very much inspired and certainly triggered a lot of discussions in my lab. So believe it or not, work and a book inspired from lizard biology and lizard evolution research has actually influenced people working on rice immune receptors. So that's how wonderful biology and evolution is. So without any further ado, we should really listen to you, and thank you so much again for agreeing to participate today and join your thoughts with this wonderful group of young people from all over the world, but mostly from the southern part of the Mediterranean. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, Zakir and Sofiane, for those very nice words. And I'm delighted to be here today. I only wish I could actually be in Tunisia, but this is the next best thing. And so thank you for the invitation. And let's see if I can get this thing going. Let's see if I can share my screen. And now, why do I always screw this up? Where did my PowerPoint go? 1 second. Oh, there it is. Not quite sure what I did, but okay, let's go. So the talk I'm going to give today is about research that basically spans my entire career. It goes on now 30 plus years. And I hope you won't mind if there's a bit of a autobiographical component to it. It really shows how I began working, doing this sort of research, and how a research program unfolds in unexpected ways over the course of a career. So we're going to start back when I was young. Some of these pictures, I was in college and others early in graduate school. And I particularly remember a very seminal event in my life was going to hear a lecture by the noted evolutionary biologist John Endler in the early 1980s. And it is just when he had started publishing his extremely well-known work on guppy evolution. And this seminar made a huge impact on me. So I think probably everyone is familiar with what a guppy is. Here's what a guppy looks like. Many people, though, don't know where guppies actually come from and much about their natural biology. Well, guppies occur on the island of Trinidad and nearby Venezuela in South America. And this is a real guppy, a natural guppy from a stream in Trinidad. They live in mountain streams, such as this one in Trinidad. And it turns out one interesting aspect of guppies is that they are highly variable, that in some places the males are extremely colorful, as in this photo here, but in other places they're quite drab. And Endler went to Trinidad following the work of some other guppy biologists and came up with a hypothesis. Well, what he found was that in places in which larger predatory fish, such as this pike cichlid, occur, the guppies are drab. But in higher reaches in the streams where the cichlids don't occur, above waterfalls, the guppies are very colorful. And so this led to the hypothesis that guppies could not be colorful in the presence of predators because the predators would see them and catch them and eat them. However, in the absence of predators, the males become colorful because for some reason, we still don't know why, females just go gaga over a colorful male guppy. And so in the absence of predators, males get more and more colorful to attract more mates. Well, this is a very reasonable hypothesis, but it's based on a correlation, the correlation between absence of predators and colorful fish. And as we all know, correlation does not prove causation. And so Endler did something that at that time was almost heretical, certainly unprecedented. He decided to do an experiment, use the gold standard of modern science, and conduct an experiment on evolution in nature. And what he did was he took a population of drab guppies that lived with pike cichlids and simply moved them above a waterfall, 20 meters away, right next door, but above a waterfall to another pool where the cichlids did not occur. And his hypothesis was that if the presence or absence of cichlids was what determined guppy color, then you move the guppies to this place and they will become much more colorful. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Over a relatively short period of time, just a couple of years, the guppies evolved to become much more colorful. He then repeated these experiments in artificial streams in the laboratory and got the same result. Well, these results were outstanding and have become famous, justifiably famous. And what they showed is not only that the particular answer to this question, but they showed that evolutionary biology can be an experimental science, even in nature, that we now know that evolution occurs rapidly when natural selection pressures are strong. And so it occurs rapidly enough that you could actually test hypotheses about evolution in real time and expect to get results over a short time scale. So this was revolutionary to me. And I kept this was made a big impact on young Jonathan's thinking. And a few years later, when I was a graduate student doing my PhD on the evolution of Anolis lizards, I came across a paper by the noted ecologist Tom Shaner from the University of California, Davis, and his then wife, Amy. And what they had done is that they had taken this lizard, the brown anole, Anolis sagrii, and they had placed them on very tiny islands. What they had discovered, is that on small islands in the Bahamas, very small islands, there are no lizards. Everywhere else there are lizards, but not on the tiniest islands. And so they thought that they would put populations of lizards on these islands and watch them go extinct and learn something about the process of extinction, something we still need to know about today. And so they did that. And what they found is, much to their surprise, that on all but the smallest islands, the lizard population survived. This is the y-axis here is how long till a population went extinct. And here is the size of the island. And you can see it doesn't take very large size, slightly more than 10 square meters. I mean, 10 square meters, that's nothing. That's smaller than the room that almost all of you are in. You put a lizard on an island that size, put a population, they put 5 or 10 lizards, that population will make it. Now, the question then is, why aren't there lizards on those islands naturally? I'll come back to that later. But that was the experiment that they reported. Well, that got me thinking that essentially, all right, let me step back and say, I had been doing my PhD looking at the evolution on a macroevolutionary, a phylogenetic timescale of Anolis lizards, tracing the evolution of characteristics such as limb length. And what we had found is that over millions of years, species of anoles that live on broad surfaces like tree trunks have very long legs. But species that use narrow surfaces, what we call twig anoles, they use narrow surfaces, they have very short legs. And such short legs had evolved repeatedly as species adapt to using narrow surfaces. Now, once again, and so that led to the hypothesis that to move around on narrow surfaces, short legs are more beneficial because it gives the lizard more agility. And we actually have good biomechanical data to support that. Whereas on broad surfaces, longer legs are favored because they allow a lizard to run faster and jump further. But once again, this is just a correlation. And wouldn't it be great to actually do an experiment to test that? Well, I realized that perhaps in some sense, Shaner had done that experiment. They had placed lizards on different islands on the Bahamas, and I suspected that those islands differed in vegetation characteristics. And it turns out that was correct. And so I approached Tom Shaner and basically said, I'm a graduate student at the time. I said to Shaner, has it occurred to you that you have in effect created an experimental study of evolution in anoles to see how they adapt to different circumstances on different islands? And Shaner said to me what I could only have hoped he would say but never expected in my wildest dreams. And he said, that's a great idea. Why don't you come be a postdoc with me and do some research on that? It was fantastic. I just what I had hoped for. And so that's what I did. And so that was the start of a lifelong, career-long research program that I'm going to talk to you about today, experimental field studies of evolution in the Bahamas. And I call it a play in 4 acts, because first we're going to talk about the initial studies, adaptation to different islands. Then we'll look at the role of interspecific competition in driving evolution. Then we'll look at the role of predation. Finally, a short bit on founder effects. And if I talk quickly enough, I'll leave a little time for an encore. Now, I do need to make very clear that this work has been a collaboration from the outset. It's been a collaboration first with Tom Shaner, whom I mentioned, and his lifelong or career-long research associate, David Spiller. More recently, two of my former graduate students, Manuel Leal and Jason Colby, both of whom are now professors in their own right, have joined our team. And so this is really a collaborative effort. So let's go to Act 1, adaptation to different environments. As I told you, Shaner placed these populations on small islands in the Bahamas. Here we are in the central Bahamas. It's in the Atlantic Ocean, just north of Cuba. And here are what our islands look like. See these islands here. I hope you can see my pointer. These are small islands. Here's a map. We're talking about these islands here. Notice here's the bar. This is a kilometer. So these are small islands. These are tiny islands, very tiny islands. And these are the islands that Shaner placed the lizards on. And as I said, I expected that they would differ in vegetation, and that was correct. Some of the islands were fairly thickly vegetated with small trees. Others, however, were very scraggly with only very narrow vegetation. And so one could well imagine that lizards on different islands were having to use different surfaces. And based on our understanding of what occurred over millions of years, we could predict that their limbs would evolve differently to adapt to the different surfaces they were using. And here's what they would evolve, follow the natural pattern. And sure enough, the lizards were using different surfaces on the different islands. On some islands, they had to use narrow surfaces. On others, they were on broader surfaces. So we went to each island, and this is what research looked like several decades ago. I just carried a chair onto each island, and I had a little, that's a monoscope, where I was looking at the lizard's toe pads, magnifying and counting the scales right there. I would take the lizard, catch it, measure how long its legs were, and then let it go. And that's how we collected the data. And here's what we found. Each point is a different island, and we're simply measuring the average hind limb length, corrected for body size, and comparing it to the average perch diameter on the islands. Probably the X and Y axes should be flipped, but be that as it may, what we see is that on islands with narrow vegetation, they have short legs, whereas on islands with broad vegetation, they have long legs. In other words, exactly as predicted, over the course of about 10 to 15 years, the populations had differentiated adaptively, exactly as predicted. In other words, we had shown rapid evolutionary adaptation. So that was a pretty exciting finding. I frankly was surprised to see it, but that's what the data show. So we published our paper in Nature. This is now in 1997. And one thing that Nature does every week before the issue comes out, they put out a press release where they hype a couple of their articles to try to get people interested. And they chose our article that week as one of the articles to highlight in their press release. And here's what they said. This may be among the most important work in evolutionary studies since Darwin studied the diversity of finches on the Galapagos Islands during the voyage of the Beagle. Well, it was a nice study, but this is way over the top. I mean, come on. But that's what they sent out in the press release. And basically, the world's media went wild. And at the time, we were in the Bahamas, and we were staying at this little hotel in Marsh Harbor, Abaco, and the Lofty Fig, in a place back then, there was no internet available. Even the place we stayed didn't have telephones. And so one day, we came back from our day in the field, and as I'm walking up, this is the manager's office, and the manager calls me over, and he says, "The New York Times is trying to reach you." And the next day came back in the Boston Globe and USA Today. And then ABC News called, and they wanted to fly a team out to film us there. I mean, all of the people just went wild based on that press release. Now, the manager of the hotel, who thought we were idiots, I mean, why are these people coming to the Bahamas and then catching lizards, was then completely befuddled at why the world's media was beating down his door and tying up his sole phone line. But anyway, we got all of this publicity about this article and this finding we made. And I have to say, it certainly was a great thing for my career. I was an early assistant professor at the time. So anyway, that's how what happened when the paper was published. And so I would give talks, much as I'm giving this talk today. But one thing happened when I give these talks. Almost every time, someone in the audience, usually, and I'm looking at you, Sophie, and usually a pesky botanist would raise their hand and say, what about phenotypic plasticity? We know with plants that how they grow depends on what their environment is. You give them a lot of sun, a lot of water, they'll grow and be very luxuriant, but you don't give them that and they'll grow much less. Could it be that the differences in limb length that you see are not a result of genetic change, but simply a result of growing up in different environments. Well, that seemed ludicrous to me, but the darn botanist kept on asking that question. So finally, I figured I'd better look into this a little bit. And so I went to the library to look up the literature on the effect of diameter, perch diameter, on lizard limb growth. Well, it turned out that was actually pretty easy to do. There was no literature on this. No one had ever studied the question. But there was a related literature that was relevant. And I have to say, these studies are, I characterize them as some of the most bizarre studies I've ever seen. And I hope no one does those studies in this audience. Once someone who did was in my audience, and I had to apologize, but they're a little bit crazy. And basically, the research area was trying to understand whether a growing vertebrate animal that is forced to exercise to use its limbs, whether that will affect what the limb bones look like compared to organisms that don't use those limbs. And so, for example, one such experiment takes mice. And in one group, the mice are forced to run on an exercise wheel for many hours every day. And in the control group, they aren't given a wheel and they don't do that. And so the question is, how does that, and they're doing this as they're growing up, as they're young mice. How does that affect the limbs? Or a similar experiment takes rats and drops them into a bathtub and makes the rats swim for 4 hours every day. And again, the control group doesn't do that. Or another study took chickens and put the chickens on a treadmill and made the chickens run for hours every day. And again, the control group didn't have to do that. Now, you're thinking to yourself, what kind of zoologist is this guy? That's no chicken, that's a mouse. Well, that is true. I could not find a picture of a chicken on the treadmill to show you. However, when I gave this talk a little while ago, at the very end of it, somebody texted me this image, which is kind of close to the idea of exercising chickens. Anyway, these studies all had looked at the effect of some sort of exercise on limb development. And as a general rule, what they found was that forcing animals to exercise does affect their bones. It makes them grow thicker. And I didn't realize this at the time, but bone is a very dynamic substance. And if you put more stress on a bone, it will lay down more calcium to strengthen itself. And so when you force animals to use their bones, they will get thicker bones. In fact, we see this in humans. Weightlifters have much thicker bones than non-weightlifters because they're putting so much stress on their bones. However, the result we found was not the thickness of the bones, but the length of the bones. And there was almost no indication in the literature that doing exercise caused bones to differ in their length, with one notable exception. And this was a study from way back in the 1950s, where people studied professional tennis players. And if you think about professional tennis players, these are people who, as boys and girls, when they're young, had been smacking tennis balls for hours every day during their formative growth years. And so the question was, would this activity affect their bones? And the great thing about this study is that each individual had his or her own control. You could compare their serving arm with their non-serving arm. And so that's what this study did. And what they found, looking at male professional tennis players, is that sure enough, their serving arms were longer than their non-serving arms. And they actually x-rayed the individual. So the bones were longer. It wasn't just that they were hanging lower, something about the ligaments or anything. The bones themselves were longer. And so that indicated that it is possible that something going on during ontogeny, during growth, could affect the length of the limb bones. So there was only one thing to do, and that was to do an experiment, to raise lizards in different circumstances to see if it would affect limb length. And so that's what we did. We got a bunch of baby brown anoles from Florida, and we grew them up at the St. Louis Zoo. And we had two treatments. In one treatment, the lizards got to live on broad surfaces, as shown here. Now, this is the natural way brown anoles sit. It's on a broad surface, its limbs are spread out. This is a happy lizard. This is not a happy lizard. This is the other treatment. Lizards forced to spend their time on narrow surfaces. And as you can see, they're holding their limbs in different ways. They're kind of hunkered down, hanging on. And so the question was, if you grow lizards in these different environments, will it affect their limb length? So here's what we found. Now, first, these are limb length corrected for size. What we found was that there is sexual dimorphism. Males have longer limbs than females. We knew that, and we confirmed it here. However, the important thing was comparing the lizards that grew on the broad surfaces with the ones on the narrow surfaces. And here's my co-author, my cat, trying to get into the act. And, oh, I see he switched the slide. And there's the result, that lizards that grow up on broad surfaces have longer legs than lizards that grow up on narrow surfaces in both males and females. We were frankly shocked to get this result, so much so that we redid, oh, here he is again, that we redid the experiment a second time and got the same result. And people have pretty much, this has been replicated in several other experiments with more or less the same results. So it turns out that limb length is a phenotypically plastic trait in anoles. However, so be that as it may, when we compare the amount of differentiation that caused in our experiment, we see here, the red bar is the difference between the broad surface and the narrow surface, and we compare that to the amount of variation among the experimental populations over here on the right side of the screen, what you see is even a very extreme difference cannot replicate the amount of difference we see in the experimental populations. And so it suggests that the amount of change that occurred in these experimental populations was more than just plasticity, that the difference is substantially greater. Now, I can tell you, we are now finally beginning to get some idea of the genes underlying limb length. And so it's taken a long time, and we're not there yet, but hopefully soon we'll actually be able to do a genetic assay to compare genetic differences. But I would argue that this result suggests that these differences that we're seeing are at least in part genetically based. All right, well, that's the end of the first part of the study. Now let's move to part two, the role of interspecific competition in driving differences in limb morphology. And to do that, we move slightly south in the Bahamas down to the island of Great Exuma. And I need to introduce a second character in our study, again with the brown anole, but now a second species, the green anole, Anolis smaragdinus, a species that is more arboreal than the brown anole. And so our question was simply, do these species interact with each other? Do they have a negative effect? Does that affect their habitat use? And in turn, could that drive differences in limb length? I should point out that the green anole is more arboreal and has shorter legs than the brown anole. So once again, we did our study on very small islands. And in this case, we located 15 islands that did not have any lizards, small islands, too small to have lizards. And we put the islands into groups of 3 similar islands. And on each island, we randomly assigned one island to get brown anoles, one island to get green anoles, and one island to get both species. And so we would compare the presence of both species to each species alone. And then we replicated these 3 treatments 5 times across the 15 islands. And so the questions were, first, can brown anoles survive on islands smaller than those upon which they naturally occur? Second, what about, can the green anoles survive on such islands? And finally, is there any evidence that they have a negative effect on each other? So we introduced onto each island 5 lizards, 2 males and 3 females. Let's start first, the first question, can brown anoles survive? Well, 1 year after the introduction, the populations had at least doubled in size. And as you can see, some of the populations had just exploded. 3 years after the introduction, look at the size of some of these populations. Now, oddly, one population, we could only find 1 lizard that year. Subsequently, that population did bounce back. But in general, the answer was brown anoles can do just fine on these small islands if you put them there. What about the green anoles? Well, here the story is different. 1 year in, 8 out of 10 populations are doing well. But 3 years in, a different story. 4 populations are now extinct, and another 2 populations are down to a single individual. And in this case, that single individual was a male. So that doesn't look very good for the population. So there is something about these islands that makes them inhospitable to green anoles. We suspect that they're too exposed and too dry, but we're not sure. Well, what about the third question? Do the brown and green anoles interact with each other? Well, remember there were 5 treatments, and in each treatment or block, there was an island, we're going to focus on the green anoles. There was an island in which the green anoles were alone, which the allopatric island, and an island where the green anoles were with the brown anole. And what we see when we compare within each block, the allopatric population, the red line, with the yellow line, is that the red line is always higher. In other words, the density of green anoles was greater on islands in which there were no brown anoles. Or looked at another way, the presence of brown anoles clearly has a negative effect on green anoles. So that had indicated that does indicate a negative effect. Brown anoles suppress green anole populations. Well, this was an exciting result. And the question then was, would that drive evolutionary change or changes in habitat use and evolution? And well, let me put that aside for a moment and say, why don't brown anoles occur on small islands? We've now shown in 2 different places that you put brown anoles there and they'll do just fine. Something must happen that keeps brown anoles from being established on small islands. And now, when you think about what such a thing might be in the Caribbean, you of course think about hurricanes. That's not something you guys have to deal with where you live, but in the Caribbean, it's a big deal. The same thing is called typhoons in Asia. Unfortunately, since Tom Shaner had been working in the Bahamas, he had started working in the Bahamas in the 1970s, just as a natural lull in the hurricane cycle had started. And so even though Shaner had suggested that hurricanes were responsible for this pattern, he had no way of testing that idea. That, however, changed in 1996. That was mid-1990s were the end of the lull in hurricane activity. And ever since, hurricane activity has been much greater. And in particular, in October of 1996, Hurricane Lily was churning its way across Cuba and was headed straight towards our study site. Now, I have to tell you, we had mixed emotions about this. On the one hand, we were excited that we might finally get to find out what role hurricanes played in lizard distributions in the islands. We've been thinking about this for a long time. We might finally find out. So that was exciting. On the other hand, we were on the islands at the time. And so we were a little nervous. So the hurricane was headed straight our way. But then as soon as it exited Cuba, it took a hard turn to the east. And as you can see, the hurricane was going to pass to the south of us. But then it changed course again, and once again was headed straight towards us. And so every 3 hours, we would tune into the BBC, the Bahamas Broadcast Corporation, and they would give the latest update on the storm, and we would plot it on a little map that the bank was handing out. And what we could see is the hurricane was heading straight towards us. And indeed, it scored a direct hit. The eye of the hurricane went directly over us. Well, by incredible good fortune, we had just finished our study, our data collection for that year, the day before the hurricane arrived. And so we were in a very unusual position that we could go back out and see what had happened. We knew what the islands were like days before the hurricane. We could see what happened afterwards. So the first thing we did was we took our boat out of a tree. Our boat had landed in a tree, our little motorboat. Somehow I failed to get a picture of that. Put it back in the water 2 days later, and we went around. And evidence of what the hurricane had done was everywhere. There were trees that had been knocked over. 17 yachts were destroyed in the harbor. Clearly, things had happened. So I didn't mention to you, but our study islands, here's where we're based in Georgetown, Great Exuma. We had some study islands to the southwest of Georgetown and some to the northeast. And the difference is that the hurricane would hit the ones in the southwest, then travel over Georgetown, then hit the ones to the northeast. Now, hurricanes slow down when they go over land, but Great Exuma is only 1 mile wide, and that's not enough land to significantly affect the hurricane speed. So it should have been the same. So we first started by looking at our islands up here on the lee side in the northwest. And what we found was that you went to these tiny islands, you could see something had happened. Leaves were stripped off of branches, branches were broken. Clearly something had happened. But by the same token, it was a quantitative effect, if you will. And that was true of the lizard populations. They were reduced by 1/3 to 40% from just a week before. So there was an effect, but it wasn't, if you will, devastating. We then went to the other side, to the windward side, the southwest. This was my favorite island in the study. This is the one island that green anoles were still thriving on. They were extremely dense. They were all by themselves on this island. When you walked through the bushes, the grass-like bushes, the lizards would just jump out of your way like grasshoppers. They were everywhere. Well, this is the island after the hurricane. We actually did not recognize that we were in the right place. All of the vegetation, all of the bushes were stripped away and gone. Only some scrubby stuff survived. Here is another island. This had been 2 big trees just snapped off, and you can see all the other vegetation is gone. Here's a third island, the same thing. It was like a bomb hit these islands. Well, we went out to count the lizard populations, and that turned out to be really easy. There were no lizards left. And so that clearly showed that hurricanes can, in fact, keep lizards from staying established on small islands. That was the answer to the question. One last question, though, why did we see this effect on the southwest, but not the northeast? As I mentioned to you, the wind speed should have been the same. Well, there was one clue. On one of the southwest islands, we saw this. This is a starfish, now called a sea star. Those of you who are marine biologists know that sea stars do not live on the tops of islands. And clearly what this indicated is that the islands were underwater. There was a storm surge of about 5 meters, and these islands were only 2 to 3 meters high. So it had covered, it had, number one, hit the islands with great force, stripping away the vegetation, and then submerged the islands for 6 hours or so. And in that way, removing the lizards. But then the storm surge hit the big island of Great Exuma, which is higher than 5 meters, and that stopped the storm surge. And there wasn't enough open water on the other side before our islands to start a new storm surge. And so that was the actual mechanism by which the lizards were removed from the islands. Well, so that was the answer to that question. We didn't get to go any further on the study of interspecific competition. We did learn, though, why small islands don't have populations of lizards. So thus, we then moved to part 3 of our study to look at the role of predation. And for a number of years, ecologists have been emphasizing the role that predation can play in regulating community structure. And so this was a new question we wanted to ask. And to do that, we moved to the north, to the island of Abaco, around the town of Marsh Harbor. And I now need to introduce our third character in these studies, and this is the predatory lizard, the curly-tailed lizard, given that name for obvious reasons. It is a larger lizard than an anole, and it is one that is primarily terrestrial. And so the question is, what role would the curly-tailed lizard play in brown anole habitat use and potentially evolution? Now, we knew that curly tails would eat brown anoles at least occasionally, but we didn't know whether this would be an important ecological and evolutionary phenomenon. Do they do this all the time and make a big impact, or just once in a blue moon with no greater significance? And so we set up an experiment, the same sort of one that we've done before, where we took 12 islands. In this case, we took islands that had brown anoles naturally, and we randomly assigned 6 of them to get curly-tailed lizards, with the other 6 serving as controls. Now, I should point out that curly-tailed lizards occur in the area we're studying, and they occur in the next island over. And we've actually documented curly-tails naturally colonizing these islands. So we are mimicking a natural process that goes on all the time. We're not bringing in a species that doesn't belong there. So the question is, what effect would the curly-tails have on the brown anole populations? Now, I had the great fortune to team up with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, who made a wonderful film about this work, and it explains it better than I can. So I'm going to show you a little clip from this film. I do want to point out one thing, though. The film refers to Jonathan and his team, and I argued with them about that terminology. They were not my team. These were my collaborators, my coworkers, and they deserve equal credit to me. And so I just wanted to make that clear. All right, I need to stop sharing and switch to the video. And let's see if I can do that without screwing up. And let's go to this video here. Share the screen again. And here we go. And it's not running. Oh, no. Are you guys here? Oh, there we go.
Jonathan wondered if he could also create an experiment that would lead natural selection favor longer legs.
I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. Let me try that one more time. I've had this happen before. Oh, I think I clicked on the wrong thing, actually. I think this will be okay. Here we go.
Jonathan wondered if he could also create an experiment that would lead natural selection to favor longer legs. He found islands that already had anoles that lived primarily on the ground.
Jason Colby there, one of our collaborators.
His team caught and measured each lizard. Then he brought in a predator, a species of larger curly-tailed lizards that eat anoles.
Here's the bad boy of our experiment. This is the curly-tailed lizard. Now, what we did is we added them to half of our islands. These are very voracious predators. What we wanted to know was, what effect would this guy have on the anoles on the island?
Would the anoles evolve longer legs to run faster, or larger body size to defend themselves?
Excellent question. Well, let's see what happens. All right, now I need to share the screen again, go back up here, and go back to my PowerPoint. There we go. So this is first the number of individuals on the islands. The black circles are the ones where the islands we put the curly tails on, and the white circles are the controls. And you can see that the islands start about the same in terms of population size, but in the absence of curly tails, the number goes way up. This is the breeding season. These are the young being born. And you can see very quickly a twofold difference in population size occurs, presumably because the curly tails are eating a lot of the babies and maybe some of the adults. And this twofold difference went through the length of the experiment. So clearly the curly tails are affecting the anole populations. The anoles are no dummies. They immediately start using higher vegetation in the presence of curly tails. And as you can see over the course of the study, their perch height went up and up and up. And we're not sure why it went up, why they just didn't go up and stop, but you can see clearly an effect on habitat use as well. Unfortunately, this is what happened. This is Hurricane Floyd. Our study site is right here. It went right over our experiment and terminated before we could see if the hypothesis was that the lizards would start evolving shorter legs as they lived higher up in the vegetation. That got wiped out. Good news is we waited 4 years and we were able to start the experiment again, time 2. Now this time though, the experiment in general was set up the same way, 12 islands, 6 of them got curly tails and so on. But knowing that there would be an effect, what we did is we caught all of the brown anoles on each island beforehand, and we measured how long their legs were. And then we gave each lizard an individual mark, the equivalent of a bird band. You can see we're injecting a non-toxic rubbery substance called an elastomer. And so here, this lizard has lime green in its humerus, upper forelimb, and red-orange on its femur component. And so each lizard was individually marked. And that means we could go back later, see which lizards survived and which ones didn't, and then see whether limb length was a predictor of survival. In other words, was natural selection operating on limb length? And then did the action of natural selection vary between control islands and those with the predators? So let's go back to the Howard Hughes video to see what happened. Oh, I hit the wrong one. I am an idiot. Let me try this again. Not that one. Ah, yes, here we go.
Jonathan wondered if he could also create an experiment.
I did it again. I'm sorry, I am inept here. I am looking for, not that, not that. It's supposed to be this one.
That would lead natural selection to favor longer legs.
All right, I can't figure out why I'm doing this wrong. I'm going to try one more time and find. This is what it's supposed to be.
He found islands that already had anoles that lived primarily on the ground.
I'm sorry, something is going wrong here. I can't get it to show the one that I want it to show.
After 6 months, he returned and discovered that on average, the survivors did have longer legs.
Come on.
They were better able to elude their foe.
All right, I give up. I'm sorry. You won't get to see. It's a wonderful film. You can find it online. And I will just tell you the results. And those results are that what we found was first that the lizards in the presence of the curly tails got off the ground. We portray it in a different way here, but you can see the percentage on the ground in the presence of curly tails is much lower. So they're moving up into the trees as we saw before. And we measured what is called a selection gradient. And a selection gradient basically looks at the difference in a trait, such as hind limb length, between the survivors and the non-survivors. Now, if the survivors have longer limbs, then the selection gradient will be high. If the survivors have shorter limbs, then the gradient will be low. And if there is no difference between the survivors and the non-survivors, the selection gradient will be 0. What we found was that in the first part of the experiment, selection in the presence of curly tails, there was strong selection favoring long-legged lizards. Lizards with longer legs survive better than lizards with shorter legs, whereas in the absence of predators, there was no selection operating. We had shown, in other words, that curly-tailed lizards are an agent of natural selection favoring long legs. So that was very exciting, and it was our prediction, but to actually see it come true was unexpected a little bit. However, remember that in the presence of curly tails, lizards are moving high into the vegetation. And what this means is as they move higher up, they start using narrower surfaces. This is the perch diameter. And in the presence of curly tails, they're using the very narrow surfaces on the twigs at the end of the bushes. Now, we know what such use does over millions of years. It favors shorter legs. So our prediction was that over time, natural selection would do a 180, would switch directions and start favoring shorter-legged lizards. Well, to our surprise, that happened quite quickly. In the second 6-month period, now selection was favoring shorter-legged lizards, a complete reversal now that the lizards were up in the bushes. Well, what would be the long-term impact of this? The lizards are now stuck high in the bushes, so every generation moving forward, selection should continue to favor shorter legs. Our prediction was that given enough time, these lizards would evolve shorter legs, perhaps start looking like twig anoles. Well, perhaps you might guess, given what I've said so far, what the next thing that happened was. You might think there was a hurricane. Well, you'd be wrong. There wasn't one hurricane, there were 2 hurricanes. The second hurricane teased us by heading towards the site, going to the north, doing a loop-de-loop, and going right over our island. 2 hurricanes hit the poor people, the poor lizards of Abaco in a 3-week period, wiping out that experiment. And so to make a long story short, we've restarted the experiment several times, but the heavy hurricane activity now in the Caribbean has prevented this experiment from moving forward. We're still hoping to get further tests of this hypothesis, but we don't know. We have not yet documented evolutionary change resulting from the curly tails. We've documented natural selection, but not that it leads to evolutionary change. So I want to briefly tell you about one other study that we did, and it has to do with the idea of a founder effect. This is an old idea that Ernst Mayr championed years ago, and the idea is that a small population will just by chance be different from the population it comes from, and that this might play an important role in evolution. I had often wondered whether founder effects might be important in anole evolution, since they colonize islands, presumably just a single lizard colonizing that island. Well, because of these hurricanes, they cleared off islands that we knew could support lizards. And so we finally decided to test the role of a founder effect. And what we did, the question is, would the populations be able to survive if you start a population with 2 individuals? And then would there be a founder effect, and would it persist? And how would it interact with adaptive processes? Well, to do this, we identified 7 small empty islands, and we took lizards from the island in the background where they lived on tall trees and a broad perch, and we just took a male and a female, randomly selected, and put them on each of 7 islands to see what would happen. And of course, part of our prediction is placing them on these islands with a narrow scrubby vegetation. Selection ought to favor the evolution of shorter legs, but would the founder effect have any impact on that? So here are some of the islands. And what we saw is, even though we started with 2 individuals, all of the islands prospered. They all did very well. And I'm not going to go through this, but we did find that there was genetic evidence that all of these populations had a reduced amount of genetic variation compared to the source population, and they were different. These are the populations 3 years after the study. And you can see that this is one island, this is another island. They have become genetically differentiated as a result of this founder effect. So there was a genetic founder effect. We also, now our research had upgraded in the years since I started. We now had an X-ray machine. And so instead of measuring the length of the limbs on the islands, we brought them back to our field laboratory and took X-rays. And I love this X-ray machine. It's the best thing I've ever gotten. And there are all kinds of great surprises. For example, many of the lizards had snail shells in their stomach. I did not realize that they ate so many snails, but it was very common we would see this. This is a female, and if you can barely see, this is an egg, that the size of the eggs of the females is quite large compared to their body size. This one, though, we found several times. Here's a snail shell, but more interestingly, do you recognize what this is? That is a lizard skull, and there's its vertebrae. This lizard has eaten a baby lizard, and we found several cases of that. Also, things like this. There was one island we found where a lot of the lizards were missing part of their forelimbs. We're not really sure what was going on. We think either crabs or seabirds may have been snapping them off, but we don't know. Anyway, the X-ray machines were great. We also looked at their toe pads by scanning them on a scanner to measure the size of the toe pads. We looked at their dewlaps with a spectrophotometer. I won't get into any of that. Suffice to say that there was a founder effect in morphology. This is the island shortly after they were created, and we can see that just by placing randomly 2 lizards on the islands, they did differ in how long their limbs were. So what happened over the course of the experiment? Would their legs get shorter as predicted? Sure enough, they did. Over the course of 3 years, all 7 islands showed a reduction in limb length exactly as predicted. However, you can see the islands at the beginning were different in their limb length, and at the end, there was a difference, and there was a statistical relationship that the ones that started with longer limbs ended with longer limbs. And so what this experiment showed first is that the founder effect did occur, both genetically and morphologically, that the populations did adapt in a predicted, consistent way, but nonetheless, natural selection did not erase the signature of the founder effect. We could see it 3 years after the study had begun, even as the populations had been adapting. Well, the question is, would eventually natural selection eliminate the evidence of the founder effect? We would have loved to have found out, but you know what I'm going to tell you. More hurricanes. And sadly, the founder effect experiment, 5 of the 7 islands were wiped out. 2 back-to-back hurricanes. All right. Well, very briefly, I'd like to tell you about 2 recent studies in the lab. Both of them were done by fantastic postdoctoral fellows. My role in these experiments was to tell them not to do it, that these projects would never work and they were wasting their time. And it turns out that I am not very convincing, or my postdocs are very hard-headed because they went ahead and did the projects anyway, and they were very fascinating. The first project was led and conceived by Uriel LaPiedra, who was a postdoc. He's now gone back home, and he's done fabulous things. His question is, what about natural selection on behavior caused by the predators? Would selection affect the behavioral tendencies of lizards? Basically, he started with the assumption that lizards differ in their behavior, what is sometimes called their personality. And you can imagine some lizards are more willing to run out into dangerous places to forage for food, whereas others are more cautious. His question was, do such behavioral tendencies exist, and would they be acted upon in natural selection by predators? So imagine we'll call the behavioral trait propensity to forage. How willing are they to go off from their tree to forage? And we can imagine that you have a population distribution that's due to individual differences. You can imagine also that in the absence of predators, the lizards that are more likely to forage will do better. They'll get more food, whereas the cautious ones will not do as well. And so you might expect the population to evolve to be more risky, if you will. On the other hand, in the presence of the predators, it might work the other way. The guys who go foraging readily get eaten, and it's the cautious ones that survive better. You might expect the evolution of more cautious behavior. So this was the conceptual framework for the study. what Uriel did is he went to our study site in Abaco, he caught almost 300 lizards, and he came up with a behavioral assay where he would measure basically what is their propensity to forage. Then he would release those lizards on the islands, 4 islands that had curly tail lizards, 4 islands without. Here is his assay. You get a lizard, you put it in a box. You then open the door to the box so it can see outside, and what it sees is a curly tail lizard in a cage, a clear cage, but its first view is there's a curly tail lizard here. Then you take the curly tail lizard away, and then you wait and see how long before the lizard is willing to go outside. So the lizard knows there's a curly tail around. How long does it wait before it goes out and starts foraging? And it turns out that if you test this repeatedly, lizards do differ consistently. There is repeatability in their propensity to forage. So that was his behavioral assay. And then he tagged the lizards and put them out on the islands. And here's what he found. Well, just as in our previous study, on the islands with the predators, they don't live as long. There's greater mortality. Moreover, in the presence of predators, the lizards are moving up into the trees, the same thing we've seen in several studies. So clearly the predators were having the same effect. But then he asked, is there any selection operating on their propensity to forage? Again, he calculated these selection gradients I told you about. What he found was that on the islands without the predators, there was no selection. It didn't matter what the lizard's behavioral tendency was, survival was not affected by it. However, on the islands with the curly-tailed lizards, there was a strong selection on propensity to forage. That the lizards that were the cautious ones survived much better than the ones that, I should say the measure is how long they spent out in the open before climbing up the tree. The ones that spent very little time that immediately went to safety survived in the laboratory assay, survived much better. So what this indicates is that curly-tailed lizards can actually act as selective agents on behavior. Well, the next question is, will that lead to the evolution of behavioral differences? Uriel has established that it does seem to be heritability in these traits, that parents, offspring resemble their parents. Unfortunately, and so the question is, would behavioral differences occur? Well, a really terrible hurricane hit the Abaco a year and a half ago now, hurricane, actually closer to 2 years, Hurricane Dorian, but the populations did survive. And so eventually, as things work out, Uriel will go back to look to get the experiment going again and see if there are actually evolutionary consequences on the behavior of these lizards. All right, the last thing I'll talk about very briefly is another study led by a former postdoc in the lab, Colin Donahue, now a postdoc at Brown University. This work done in collaboration with a number of people, but primarily Anthony Harel of the Paris Museum of Natural History. And this study took place in the Turks and Caicos Islands to the southeast of the Bahamas. Two particular islands there, small islands, Water Key and Pine Key. And the focus is a different species, Anolis scriptus, very similar to the brown anole. It's convergent in morphology and habitat use, occupies the same habitats. Now, these two islands have been overrun by invasive species, by goats, by rats, by cats, and they've impacted the environment greatly. And a wonderful group called Fauna and Flora International was planning to remove the introduced species to restore the environment. And so Colin had the great idea of why not see how the lizards respond as the vegetation recovers, as their predators are removed, to see if they change their habitat use and see whether they actually show an evolutionary response. So in order to test this idea, he and Anthony and some others went to the islands to measure the baseline habitat use and morphology before the removal of the introduced species. And so they went and did that and measured the typical things that we measure in such things, their morphology, aspects of their habitat use, and so on. And then they left on September 4th, 2017. Well, that date is important because 4 days later, Hurricane Irma went straight over these islands. And 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria did the same thing. And so 2 hurricanes hit the islands right after Colin and team had censused the lizards. So the obvious questions, were the hurricanes, what effect did they have on these lizards? Were they actually even possibly agents of natural selection? So as soon as they could, Colin and Anthony went back to the islands to census them. So remember, they had great data immediately before the hurricane. What would the populations be like afterwards? Now, I do need to point out, they didn't know these hurricanes were coming. They had not individually marked the lizards. So what they were doing was comparing the population characteristics before and after, but not looking at particular individuals. Well, the most exciting finding was that on both islands, after the hurricane, the populations had larger toe pads than they did before the hurricane. Now, there are several possible explanations. I'd be happy to talk about it later, but the most likely explanation is that lizards with larger toe pads could hang on better and survive the hurricane, that the lizards with the smaller toe pads had been blown away. And so it seems to be evidence of natural selection caused by a hurricane affecting the toe pads of the lizards. Well, that's an exciting and unexpected. I mean, the other hypothesis is that the hurricane randomly killed lots of lizards, but there was no selective component. These results seem to argue that natural selection was operating. This is particularly interesting because we have long known that lizards, Anolis lizards in mainland Central and South America have larger toe pads than they do on the islands. And people, for years, I'd mentioned that, and people would ask me, well, maybe it's because there are very few hurricanes that occur in the Amazon or throughout Central America. And so maybe, I said this backwards, they have larger toe pads on the islands. And so people said, maybe it's because hurricanes occur on the islands. And I'm like, no, those hurricanes don't happen that frequently. It's not going to make a difference that you can see over broad geographic and evolutionary timescales. Well, Colin decided to look into this question further. Again, I encouraged him not to do this. It would be a waste of his time. He'd never find anything. But he persisted, and teaming up with a meteorologist at Penn State named Alex Kowaleski, they did something very clever. What they did is they found the number of major hurricanes that had hit in a variety of different places in the Caribbean. And the size and color of the graph is an indication of hurricane intensity. And then they compared the toe pad size of the brown anole that occurred on all these islands. And what they found was, sure enough, on places in which there had been more hurricanes, the lizard had larger toe pads. Hard to come up with an explanation for that because you can see there's no real geographical component to where the hurricanes are more intense. But then Colin took it one step further and looked across the entire Anole radiation, doing the same sort of analysis. And again, what you find is that species, there's a lot of scatter, of course, because species toe pads are affected by their habitat use, but still there is a signal of hurricane activity. Lizards that live in areas where there are more hurricanes have larger toe pads, all else equal. So this would seem to suggest that hurricanes actually may be an agent of, not only an agent of natural selection, but one that has a long-lasting impact that affects the diversity of this wide-ranging group. So again, a very exciting and, to my mind, unexpected finding. Well, I've talked a little bit long, so I think I'll wrap it up here just by saying, I can tell you when I started this research program 30 years ago, I never thought that I would have anything to do with hurricanes, much less they'd be a major part of my research in many different ways. So that's just how research programs develop over time. I can tell you, though, I really wish the hurricanes would stop, or at least let us finish some of these experiments. And so not only to find out what we can about the lizards, but for the poor people who actually live there. And maybe we'll be able to finish some of these experiments and get a longer evolutionary viewpoint. Well, with having said that, thank you again very much for this invitation, and I would be delighted to answer any questions.
Oh, thank you, Professor Jonathan, for this great talk. It's outstanding. And I have some questions by myself, but let's leave the opportunity for other people. If they have any questions, they could ask and they can unmute them. Also, Professor Sofiane, if you have any comment or question, let me know.
Let's start with the students and the postdocs in the audience. I think the priority should be to the early career scientists.
All right, let's wait. If there is anyone. I think that they are still a little bit shy, so I'll try to ask some questions. So, Professor Jonathan, obviously islands are, we call them the living testing tubes, are appealing for many scientists to work on because we can witness wonderful observation like the insight that you just gave. If you had any advice to give for young grad students or researchers who want to work and conduct research on ancillary ecosystem but couldn't afford going to island, you know, the process of visiting islands sometimes could be complicated. You think that there are other ways to work on ancillary ecology without being to an actual island ecosystem, like maybe testing urban ecology? Could we witness similar results?
Well, that's an excellent question. And that's something that we have tried to do and other people have tried to do. The advantage of islands, of course, is that they are contained, that you don't have to worry about lizards wandering off. You know, if we can't find a lizard on the island, we can assume that it's dead. It's not that it just wandered 20 meters away. And the number of new lizards arriving is extremely small. And so it's a contained unit. And that's one of the real advantages. One possibility is with people disrupting habitats, we have created habitat islands by leaving, say, a patch of forest surrounded by a city. And so in many places, it might be able to find island-like habitats, just as you suggest, in an urban landscape. And I think that's one alternative. Or sometimes, you don't need an island. It just makes some things easier. Say that you're just working in a forest somewhere. Well, you could measure all of your lizards in a plot in the forest. And then when you come back 6 months later, you just have to search outside that plot very carefully to see if some of the lizards had immigrated instead of died. And so that is a possibility. In fact, that's what most people do. So I do think there are opportunities to do that. I also think that a topic that is increasingly recognized as interesting and important is the one you mentioned, urban ecology. How are species accommodating to living around us? How are they able to survive? Which ones can survive? Are they actually adapting? That's a question that people have only really started looking at. And I think there are plenty of opportunities to look just around where you live and to test ideas that are very interesting and relevant.
Right, thank you. Thank you for the answer. So we have a question from Professor Michel. Professor Michel, I can unmute you if you want to ask it by yourself, or I can read it. You let me know if you want me to.
No, you can read it yourself.
All right, thank you. So he thank you for your presentation. He said in the Mediterranean, we don't have hurricanes. We have instead the long time effects of the sea level oscillations since the last glacial maximum. So I'm suggesting that his question is that this oscillation has an effect on maybe the population of lacerted lizard in these islands, the Mediterranean.
Well, there's been some fantastic work along those lines, looking at Greek islands in particular. And your next speaker in a week or two has been involved in that. It is spectacular work. And what is particularly nice is the good understanding of how sea level has changed over time. And so you can incorporate that into your studies to see what effect a population on an island today, look across many different islands and see whether you can see a signature of some sort of sea level changes in the past. And so I think that's the work that has been done already along those lines has been very, very influential. And I think there more such studies would be very fascinating. So yes, I think that's a great opportunity. Another aspect of that is the fact that these islands vary in their human impact. Some islands have not been affected much, others have been transformed greatly. And so these islands present the opportunity to look at such questions. And I do need to put in a plug for Colin Donahue, who did that hurricane work, but he's been working on some Greek islands, looking at lacertids there for quite a long time. And they found some really fascinating patterns about how the islands differ as a result of the size of the island and other characteristics.
Right, thank you. If we have any other questions, I can unmute you and you can.
Looks like we have someone raising their hand.
All right, let's see who's. Yep, okay. All right, ask to unmute.
Can I tell you something?
Yes, we can hear you, Shauki.
Thank you, Dr. Jonathan, for the amazing presentation. So we can see that the anoles and maybe all the reptiles can be affected very fast by the environment. So what about using them as bioindicators to the effect of humans or any effect on their environment?
That's a great question, and it's complicated, or their possibilities are diverse because there are many species of Anolis lizards. I didn't really talk about that, but there are 150 different species on Caribbean islands, and they vary in basically how resilient they are to human interaction. And there are some species like brown anoles, they thrive in human settings because they like open habitats. And so when we cut down forests and replace it with buildings and parking lots, that's actually great for them. So their presence is actually, if anything, a sign that the habitat has been messed up. Whereas there are other species that are more restricted to closed forests and are less hardy to disruption, and you just don't find them in disturbed habitats. So I think you definitely could use anoles as bioindicators, but it would be more than just presence or absence, but looking which species are present and which aren't. And that, one of the interesting things in Cuba, for example, is that the brown anole is found all over Cuba, almost everywhere. But that's because they've cut down the forest everywhere. Probably before humans got to Cuba, the brown anole was just on the fringes. But today, it takes advantage of the changes. Whereas the other closely related species of the brown anole that live in the forest, you only find in forests. Anyway, it's a very interesting question, something that hasn't been taken much advantage of.
Thank you for the explanation. So I think Claudia want to say something. I can unmute you. Yeah, all right.
So good evening to everybody. I'm talking from Florence, Italy.
Hello.
Ciao, Jonathan. I would like to ask Jonathan if he received the mail I sent him a couple of days ago. And I digit here, I give you an, sorry, Nicola. Here, I would like to inform everybody, also my Tunisian colleagues, that the 11th meeting on the symposium on the Mediterranean lacertid lizards will take place online in September in Italy. So you are all invited to register if you want. It's very cheap, and we will hold it online because of the pandemic, as you know, and it would be really nice to have also all the colleagues from North Africa. I would suggest the colleagues to work. They have a very nice place, in my opinion, in Tunisia, where they can do nice experiments, which are the Kerkena Islands. You surely know.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of islands, which can even be reached walking from an island to another one. And so far, this island, I think that Professor Losos would be very happy to visit those islands because they're very interesting. That's not that much difference in lizard species. but you find Mesalina olivieri quite everywhere, where even on an island which is 1 square kilometer or even less big. And this could be very nice place, in my opinion. I would suggest to the colleagues to use this place as a experimental. I published a report on the Kerkena Island together with the help of the Tunisian colleagues, and you can find it on internet. We did it with the French group of the French group who studies biology of the small islands of the Mediterranean. So this was a communication, and
thank you, Claudia.
of course the talk of Jonathan was excellent, like all the talks I already was lucky to hear, even in the congresses around the world. And
thank you.
it would be nice to move a bit westward in the Mediterranean instead to stay always with Panayotis and with all that people in Greece. We are jealous.
All right.
Thank you for your kind
words. I'm joking, Jonathan.
Yeah, I would like to say that I attended, I think, the 7th Lacertid Mediterranean Lacertid conference in 2008 in Greece, and it was spectacular. So I would expect this one will be equally as spectacular.
I'm sorry, it will not. It will be. I can say that it goes from Lipari Island in the Aeolian Islands, and before this meeting, which will be held only online, the meeting of the Italian Society of Herpetology will take place there. So in case you are already there, you could probably follow the meeting with us from some computer there. I mean, I don't know, but in any case, you are all invited to take part to both meetings. You will find it on our webpage of the Italian Society of Herpetology, but I already sent you the link for the lizard, because lizards are good tools to study evolution. And we have hundreds of thousands of islands here in the Mediterranean where we can do this. And this is to improve studies. The young people has to follow us. When we decided to found this meeting, it was during the first Congress of Herpetology, together with Nick Arnold, with Stratis Valakos, Valentin Perez Mellado, we decided to found this meeting. And I'm happy that it still survive, and we need young people to go forward. So also the North African colleagues are welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Claudia. I think that for your comment, hopefully we will have the opportunity to work together further soon. So I have another question, maybe it is my question, and I want to ask Professor Jonathan if, other than morphological variation between males and females, have you detected any difference in behavior that could affect differently the selection process in your experiment? Probably difference in foraging area maybe larger in males, such they would be more exposed to predators.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And we have not studied that particularly, but I do believe males have larger foraging areas. We did compare, this is a little bit of a tangent, but one of the things that Manuel Leal, one of our collaborators, did was look at their head bobbing display. That anoles do this behavior, like many lizards, where they nod their heads up and down. And what he found was that on islands with predators, they have smaller amplitude of their displays. They don't move their heads up and down as much, presumably because it's too risky to draw attention, to be too obvious. But the implication of that, and this needs to be studied further, is the lesser moving of the head probably makes it harder to attract females and get their attention as well, females of their own species. Yeah. And so it could, in this way, the social structure of the populations might be different because lizards can't be as effective at maintaining territories and attracting mates. So I think the sort of question you were talking about would be a very rich one for further study, but that's what we've done to date.
All right. All right, thank you. So I'm gonna leave the opportunity again for any questions. Maybe Professor Kamoun have a comment.
Actually, there is a question, Zeher, from Nasser from Algeria, and it's a question similar to the one I was thinking about. And a question for Jonathan. Nasser mentions that there are a large number of viruses that can infect reptiles, and he was wondering whether this ever came up in your work. And I was actually thinking about that too. Have you come across any sort of parasite interactions that may affect your Anole lizards?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm embarrassed to say that is something we have not explored. There has been some work on various diseases and parasites of lizards. They get malaria, for example, and there's some very interesting patterns of malarial occurrence or non-occurrence. At times, we capture lizards that have nodules on their bodies that clearly there's something in there. But we have not looked at that. And in general, the field has not, there's been very little work of this sort, which is unfortunate because, as we all know, disease, and we're seeing it ourselves today, disease can have important impacts on populations, and it just has gotten very little attention. It would be fascinating to look at. And I do think the most work that's been done has been on malaria, and it's some very interesting patterns, and it is possible to monitor malarial presence or even look at its impact on individuals. But that's about as much as I can tell you. It would certainly be interesting for more work of that sort.
Right, thank you. Do we have any other question? Maybe I have one, if possible. I asked a lot of questions, but my question is, could hurricanes under long-lasting pressures be the cause in the shift of the distribution of this species? Maybe it will lead them to leave these islands? Is it possible?
Well, there's an interesting, on that hurricane I told you about when we were there, we were back in the water 2 days after the hurricane on our boat, and the water was just full of debris that had been thrown off the big island and was now floating around. And one could well imagine a lizard hanging on to that debris and colonizing an island. And so I emphasize the negative destructive effects of the hurricane, but it probably plays a role positively. In fact, there's a great story that I love. This is not my own research, but the island of Anguilla in the Caribbean, you probably don't know of it. It's just a Caribbean island, does not have iguanas on it. There are green iguanas, iguanas that occur throughout much of the Caribbean. Anguilla does not have iguanas. And one day, some local people saw a big mass of vegetation, tangled branches and leaves and so on, floating in the water and drifting ashore, which happens periodically. But what was unusual in this case is that there were 15 green iguanas, and it was a big mass of vegetation. And so the vegetation washed ashore, and the iguanas just got off and came onto the beach. And now Anguilla does have iguanas. That population has persisted for, I think we're talking 30 years now. And so a great example of something like that can happen. Now, a funny side story of that is the question is, where did these iguanas come from? Well, there was a clue, because in this big mass of vegetation, there was a street sign, and the street sign was in French. And there are only 2 islands in the area that are French islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe. And several weeks earlier, a hurricane had gone right over Guadeloupe. And so presumably that's where the iguanas came from. But yes, the long way of saying hurricanes probably have both a creative as well as a destructive effect in terms of moving these animals around.
Oh, amazing story. Whoa. So we have a question from Claudia first, then we go to Marcus. Go ahead.
Yes, very quickly. Jonathan, I saw the picture of an island with green iguanas, if I'm not wrong. You showed us plenty of bushes, green herbs, and so on. And after the hurricane, everything was washed away. How is the soil there? How is the soil relative, is it sand soil which get easily washed away from water and wind, or is it more, it doesn't seem to be a stable soil?
So that's a great question. These are limestone islands. And so we get pockets of soil in the depressions in the limestone. It's very eroded. It can be treacherous to walk over it. And so there's a thin layer of soil on top, and then there are these depressions, these holes in the limestone where you'll have some soil as well. So it's not sandy. The soil is certainly not very strong, and most of the bigger plants are rooted deep into the rocks. And one of the things that we have found in our studies is that these islands are pretty resilient, that even the ones that just got creamed, like the ones I showed you, a few years later, the vegetation has come back. But that's the story on the soil.
Okay, thank you. No, because the soil, if it is a stable soil, also the plants could be more stable. And this is, if there is an increase in the future of hurricanes, it is expected that most of the populations will disappear.
Yes, one thing that we have noticed that over the now almost 30 years we've been working around Abaco is that some of the islands, the vegetation is not as luxuriant as it used to be. And we don't know whether that's the impact of the 6 or 8 hurricanes that have hit there over that time, or it might be it's getting drier. Maybe it's even us walking on the islands every year. We're not sure. But we have seen a trend that the vegetation is less thick than it used to be.
Thank you.
All right, so the question of Marcus. Marcus, you can ask it by yourself if you want to, or let me know if you want me to say it.
Oh, well, I can ask it myself. Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Well, I was just wondering whether similar patterns can be found in geckonid lizards as well, with like topad size, because there is quite some geckonid lizards that are found in the Caribbean as well, with all the hurricanes occurring. So I could imagine that we could find a similar pattern on the topad size as well in these.
It's a great question, and no one has looked at that. It would be really fascinating to see, but it just hasn't been done. You should do it.
Yeah, I wish.
No, that would be very interesting. One would expect that. Geckos and anoles. Of course, geckos are quite variable, even the ones that occur in the Caribbean. And some of them are more similar in their natural history to anoles than others. But
exactly.
still one might expect as a general rule that certainly the geckos that stay out a lot, that sleep in exposed places and so on, you would think that if topads help anoles survive, they ought to help geckos survive as well. So it certainly would be interesting to look at.
All right, thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Professor Jonathan. So I think we're gonna finish with the question of Rasen, the last one. And Rasen, maybe you can ask it by yourself if you want to. Rasen, can you hear me?
Hey,
So,
sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I can hear you. Yeah, so if I put my question into context, I'm currently studying spiders, the diversity and ecology in Tunisia, and have recently got the opportunity to visit Tunisian islands. And even though I'm mainly studying diversity and basic ecology, fundamental ecology, I thought about trying to valorize my expeditions to the islands. And I wondered what would be the main features or or things to focus on and compare between the islands. And there are certainly many known examples and studies about this. Some are specific to species compositions, others to body size. These are basic to when studying insularity. That's all.
Well, that's a very apt question with regard to anoles, because most of my research and most of the people studying anoles have focused on the island species, but there are actually more species on the mainland than there are on the islands. There are 250 mainland anole species and 150 island ones. And so the question is, how do they differ? And ecologically, the biggest difference is that the mainland species are much less abundant. And whether that's due to competition with other insectivores, or I think it's more likely that there are so many more predators on the mainland, we don't know, probably both, and maybe other factors. In addition, the mainland species are more cryptic. They're less active, less drawing attention to themselves. So those are patterns that are often seen in island mainland comparisons. In the evolutionary aspect, not only are there more species on the mainland, but at any one place, you can find as many as 15 species in one general area on the mainland, whereas in the islands, the maximum is 11. So you can have very complex communities of anoles in both places. And when you compare the species, there's a lot of diversity in both places in terms of habitat use and morphology and so on, but they're different. They're not the same set of habitat specialists on the mainland as on the island. So in the two places, the group is abundant and diverse in both, but they've done so in different ways. And that's actually an area that we're looking at right now to try to understand how they're different. And so I guess those are, in general, the questions I would look at: the overall ecological characteristics, the population demographics, and then just the diversity patterns. To what extent do they show differences in where they are and what their phenotype is like? Right? It's still a fascinating topic that would certainly repay more study.
So I think Professor Sufyan has something to say. And
yeah, I thought it's a great discussion. I'm really enjoying this, although this is not directly my field, but it's a wonderful discussion. I thought it would be good to end with a question that's maybe more of a career advice for the young people we have in the audience. And Jonathan, I think seeing your work and your career development, and I'm looking at myself actually and many of my colleagues, some of the scientists end up sort of focusing on a biological system like you're on a lizard and so on, but others are more driven by biological questions, and the two also come together, obviously. But it's a fascinating topic to me, is how careers develop and whether people actually stick to one system. I know I couldn't do that. I didn't manage to stick to one experimental system. So do you have any advice for the young people? We just heard Gassen actually mention about spiders and so on. So I know many people are drawn to one particular organism or biological system, but any advice on this topic?
Well, that's a great question. And the two approaches, I agree with you entirely. There are some people who they have a question they want to answer, and they figure out what organism can I study this in? Other people are fascinated with a type of organism. I never meant to spend my entire career working on the same type of lizard. And in fact, a number of years ago, 20 years ago, I sort of said, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want my research to be driven by the species. I want to address questions. And in conjunction with my lab, we started looking at other types of organisms, still reptiles, but other groups. But then we got sucked back into anoles, because one of the things that we've found is that every time you answer a question, it leads to 3 new questions. And some of these new questions are really fascinating. And so that's why I ended up, at that point, I gave up and said, all right, I'm going to spend my career studying anoles. I think the trick is, on the one hand, it would be easy to follow the questions into very narrow organism-specific topics. That there are aspects of anole biology that are interesting to people who study of anoles, but have no greater significance. And it's, that's not for a career, although that's important, somebody's got to study that, but still, ideally, you would want to study questions that have some broader relevance. So I'm all in favor of sticking with a group, because you really know a group well, you can study it with so much more insight, but it's important to keep the bigger picture of why these questions might be important. On the other hand, it is true, I think, that our science is a little bit different than other sciences, say chemistry or physics, where you can derive general principles that apply across the board. Biodiversity is very much an inductive science, where we really need to understand many different organisms and then see what the general patterns are and try to understand them, but also see what the exceptions are. And the only way for us as a field to do that is to have really rich and deep understandings of different organisms. And to do that, you need people who really focus on those groups. So there certainly is a lot of value in that. So I'm kind of rambling, and there's no one answer. It depends on what interests you. I think more than anything else, you need to find a question that really excites you, that you want to spend time, that learning about it will keep you going. And for different people, that's different sorts of things. I will say this, there have been several times in my career, the studies that I look back on most fondly are studies that I learned something about some organism that we didn't know before. And like, well, maybe there are 6 people in the world who actually care, but still, this is new knowledge. And that was very rewarding to go out. No one knew about this lizard before, and we discovered it and we told the world. And I found that very rewarding. So, find what interests you and really drive it home. That would be my advice.
Right, thank you for the advice. And with that, I hope everyone will take it in consideration. I think for now, we're gonna say goodbye, and we want to thank you again for your acceptance to be with us today. It was really very interesting listening to you. And I want to say goodbye to everyone, and thank you for being with us today. So bye-bye.